If you enjoyed this story and want more incredible sci-fi adventures with the Cubs and their human, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Veth Prime was not a place built for softness. The station hung in the outer arm of the Kareth expanse like a clenched fist, its corridors smelling of engine oil, hot metal, ozone from 1,000 training fields running at once. It housed 1,200 young soldiers in training, cubs from 15 different apex species, all of them dangerous, all of them proud. All of them watched by instructors who had traded warmth for results long before arriving here. The Dravari cubs were among the fiercest residents of the station, descended from ambush hunters with retractable claws. Bioluminescent spinal ridges that shifted color with emotion, dense muscle packed into compact frames built for explosive violence. They were feared by every species that had faced them. On Veth Prime they were feared too, mostly, except that the Dravari cubs in Unit 11 were still small, still growing, still making the kind of mistakes that older cadets laughed at across the mess hall. There were 7 of them. Ro was the eldest, carrying himself with a dignity his size had not yet earned. Kessa moved like smoke, always watching before acting. Tiv was loud in the way fire is loud. Brix had a scar across his left ridge from a training accident and wore it like a declaration. Pip was the youngest, barely past transition, with overlarge eyes and a habit of going still when things moved too fast. Vel was quiet in the way deep water is quiet. Waru laughed at everything, including pain, which the others had decided was either wisdom or damage. Unit 11 had been assigned to Instructor Mira Vasquez 14 months ago. Nobody on the station had fully understood why a human was stationed at Veth Prime at all. Humans were not predators in the biological sense. No claws, no venom, no reinforced bone or thermal sensing. Nothing that should have made them impressive in a place like this. Most of the station had expected Mira Vasquez to last for months. She arrived on a transit shuttle with 2 crates, a battered notebook filled with dense handwriting in 4 languages, and a calm expression that did not waver when a Goreth senior cadet knocked his shoulder into hers in the landing bay and said something dismissive in his own tongue. She set down her crate, looked up at the Goreth, who stood nearly 3 times her height, met his eyes, then said something back to him in his own language, flawlessly, with a flat tone that managed to be both polite and absolute. The Goroth blinked, walked away. That was how the station learned about Mira Vasquez, before she had even reached her quarters. Unit 11 met her on their second morning cycle. She stood in their training room wearing standard blacks, holding a tablet, looking at each of them with steady brown eyes that catalogued without judging. She introduced herself as their cultural liaison officer. Tiv immediately asked if humans were edible. The room went very still. Mira looked at Tiv for 3 full seconds and said she had been told she tasted like determination, and that most species found determination difficult to digest. Tiv stared. Then he laughed so hard his spinal ridges lit up gold. That was the first day. By the 3rd week, she knew all 7 names in the full Dravari vocal register, the true names that required a specific throat movement most non-Dravari could never produce. She had practiced in her quarters every night until she could say them correctly. When Ro heard his real name from her mouth, his ridge flickered blue, which was the Dravari equivalent of pressing a hand to the chest. She noticed. She never made a performance of knowing things. She used every piece of knowledge she gathered to show them they were seen. Pip, who had been sent to Veth Prime from a homeworld settlement so remote it barely had interstellar connections, had never been away from his family before. He did not say this. He ate alone for the first week, sat at the edge of group exercises, startled at sounds the others ignored. Mira began leaving small things on his bunk. A nutrient packet matching the flavor profile of his homeworld region. A printed image of the Dravari constellation cluster visible from his birth settlement. A note in his language that said simply that being new in a big place was not the same as being small in it. Ugh. Pip kept every single one under his sleeping mat. On the 47th day of the 3rd training cycle, the station broadcast system activated without warning during the meal hour, which on Veth Prime meant everyone was listening. Commander Dreva's voice came through every speaker on every level. The announcement was short. Veth Prime would host the interspecies cycle race at the end of the current training season. Open registration for any cadet unit. The course would run through the outer maintenance corridors, the suspended catwalks above the engine array, the exterior pressure lock channel, the inner market district, the old combat simulation ring, and terminate at the central plaza. The winner would receive a formal commendation on their unit record, accelerated equipment privileges, a place in the senior training cohort, and a banner hung in the central corridor where all of the station would see it. The announcement ended. The mess hall erupted. Unit 11 heard it from their training room. They all went still in the way. Dravari goes still when something important enters their awareness. Then they all started talking at once. Tiv was already on his feet. Kessa was calculating. Brix touched his ridge scar. Pip looked at Mira. She was looking at the announcement panel with the expression they had learned to read, as thinking seriously. She turned back and asked if any of them had cycle experience. 3 raised hands. She picked up her tablet and began typing the registration form. The senior cadets in the adjacent unit heard through the wall partition. Laughter started within the hour. A Gorath unit captain found out that the small Dravari cubs in Unit 11 had entered and told his unit, who told 3 others. By dinner, the story had spread through the entire cadet wing. Later, Aletha's senior cadet stopped Ro in the corridor and told him the course was not designed for cubs who still slept in grouped bunks. Ro told him it was not designed for species who needed 4 eyes to see what was directly in front of them. Mira, 2 steps behind, heard all of it. She told Ro quietly that night that the response was sharp and probably deserved, but that the best answer to people who doubted them was not a better insult. It was showing up at the finish line. None of them forgot that. The race was 32 days away. They had no cycles. Mira spent 2 days in administrative channels and came back with an allocation of 2 older cycles and 3 hours of bay time per night cycle, less than every other registered unit had received. She told them they would rotate in pairs, riders working while the rest observed and analyzed. The first night was a disaster. Both cycles were older models, one with a steering torque imbalance, one with a gear sync that stuttered on inclines. Ro went down twice in the first 20 minutes, taking corners at the wrong angle. Kessa was technically clean, but braked too early, bleeding time on every straight. Tiv rode the torque imbalance cycle by leaning against the pole with his body mass, which was impressive until he went off the edge of the practice lane into a storage rack. Nobody was hurt. The storage rack was different. It filed out of the equipment bay with bruises, a logged incident report, and 0 competitive times. Mira walked with them back to the bunk block and said nothing for most of the walk. At their corridor entrance, she stopped and faced them. She told them she had expected the first night to go badly. She told them nothing she had seen tonight changed what she believed about them. She had been watching them for 14 months, and she knew what they were capable of when something mattered to them. She said she would see them the next night cycle. Same time, same bay. Then she walked to her quarters 3 levels up. Pip watched her go until she was out of sight. Inside the bunk block, after the lights dimmed, Ro spoke in the dark. He did not speak loudly. He said they needed to win this race, not for the banner, not for the record. He said Mira had registered them when everyone was laughing. She had spent 2 days in administrative channels for 2 broken cycles. She believed something about Unit 11 that the rest of the station did not, and he was not going to let that belief sit unrewarded. Nobody disagreed. Pip said nothing, but his ridge glowed a slow, steady amber in the dark, which was the Dravari color of resolve. By the second night, they had changed everything. Kessa had spent the off hours studying the course through station layout schematics and identified every critical juncture, every elevated section where weight distribution would determine cornering, every floor surface change that would catch unprepared riders. She laid it out on a surface borrowed from Mira, with a precision that silenced even Tiv. Mira asked one question about the pressure lock channel. Kessa answered without hesitation. Mira told her she had found something most other units had missed. Kessa stood a little straighter. Brix had spent the morning with the equipment bay technician, 4-armed Vishani named Tor, who had no interest in cadet politics and a great deal of interest in mechanical problems. Brix described the torque imbalance in enough technical detail that Tor agreed to help in exchange for 3 maintenance jobs. Brix agreed immediately and came back to the session with both cycles running correctly. Times began improving, not dramatically, consistently. On the 17th night, Brix went down hard on a simulated pressure lock section at full speed and came up with a deep gouge across his forearm, bleeding dark against his scales. He sat against the wall while Mira wrapped the wound. The others kept riding because stopping was not something anyone suggested. Brix watched them from the wall with his ridge glowing gold the whole time. Mira tied off the bandage and sat beside him for a moment. She asked if he was all right. Said he was. She said she knew. She said she was asking anyway. He looked at her with the full-faced attention that Drevery reserved for things they consider important. He said that in his culture, an instructor who asked after a wound already treated was expressing that the warrior mattered beyond their function. He said most instructors on this station did not do that. She said she was not most instructors. Then he stood up, tested the arm, decided it was usable, went back to the rotation. 22 days in, 7 days before the race, the station council revised the race regulations. A new weight class provision had been added. Units with a collective mass under a specified threshold would be grouped in a separate division. It sounded like fairness. It was not. It was a reclassification that carried no banner placement, no commendation, no senior cohort access. A junior division. A participation division. A division nobody took seriously. The announcement came through during afternoon session. Rowe read the provision 3 times. His ridge went dark, which in Drevery biology indicated something colder than anger. Tiv made a sound that the station translation filters declined to render. Pip sat down on the floor. Oru did not laugh. That was how the others knew it was serious. They brought it to Mira. She read the provision. She read it twice. She asked them to give her the evening. She was gone for 6 hours. She came back with a formal objection filed with the race committee, a parallel appeal to the station commander. A technical argument built around a classification ambiguity in the provision text, a written statement from Tor confirming their equipment specifications, and a secondary argument based on the original announcement language that had made no provision for weight class division at all. She had done all of this in 6 hours. She handed the documentation to Rowe and said she could not promise it would work. She said she had found every available path. Rowe held the documentation and looked at the hours of work in his hands. He said her name in the full Drevery register, the real one. Then he said something that had no direct translation into the standard tongue, but that Kessa later rendered approximately as she is, the reason we know what worth looks like. The race committee heard the objection 2 days before the race. Mira stood in front of 5 senior station officials in a room designed to make the person standing in it feel small. She was small. She stood as if the room had made an error of architecture and trying to use that against her. She presented every argument cleanly and without retreat. The committee deliberated for 40 minutes. They reinstated Unit 11 to the primary division. Mira walked out and found all 7 cubs waiting in the corridor outside. She looked at 7 pairs of eyes. She said they were in. Tiv made a sound that briefly activated the corridor acoustics sensor. Pip launched himself at her from 4 feet away. She caught him. He was dense with young muscle, nothing soft about the Drevery body plan. But she held on. He gripped her in the full Drevery hold that in their culture meant complete trust, extended without reservation. She held him until he was ready to let go. He was not ready for a while. That was fine. The night before the race, Mira took them to the upper observation deck, using a clearance she technically had for other reasons. They stood at the transparent wall looking out at the star field above the station. The Kerith expanse was thick with stars. The Drevery constellation cluster that Pip had a printed image of under his sleeping mat was visible, clear, exactly where it should be. Tiv told a long story about a creature from his homeworld that had once eaten his father's transport vehicle, and his father had spent 6 years being annoyed about it. Everyone listened to all of it. Mira told them about a race she had run as a child on her home planet, on foot, which she had lost because she spent the first half helping a smaller child who had fallen. She said she had not regretted it once. She said she did not always think winning and doing right were the same thing. But tomorrow, she thought they could be both. She said she was proud of them. Not for what they might do tomorrow, for who they had already shown themselves to be, for refusing to accept someone else's decision about their worth. Their ridges were gold, amber, blue, all at once. Pip had all 3 simultaneously. Race morning came with the low tonal call that served as the station clock. There were 11 units in the primary division, 3 senior Gorath units with full equipment allocations, 2 Lethus units that had placed in previous races, 1 Corvin unit built on pure momentum, 1 joint species unit trained for 7 months on premium equipment. Unit 11 arrived at the staging area early and used the time to walk the first course sections physically, while Kessa briefed each transition point from memory. The Gorith captain watched. Aletha's senior cadet, who had mocked them weeks earlier, stood near their staging position and watched Kessa's briefing without saying a word. Mira was in the observer section above the staging area, where the rules required non-participant officers to stand. She was too far for her expression to be read. Ro looked up at her once. She raised her right hand in a held, flat gesture. In Draveri body language, it meant, "I see you, and I hold what I know about you." She could not have known that specifically. Somehow she knew it. Ro's ridge went gold. He turned back to his unit. He told them it was time. The race launched in staggered sequence. Unit 11 drew fourth position. They entered the maintenance corridor in formation and ran their race from the first meter. The torque imbalance work Tiv had done translated immediately on the first long straight. Kessa's corner analysis showed itself at the first transition, where the maintenance corridor met the suspended catwalks, a sharp left with a floor surface change that cost a senior unit significant position. Unit 11 came through it clean because they had drilled that corner for 9 days until it was not thought but reflex. The catwalks above the engine array were 40 meters over the engine core. They were narrow, vibrating at speeds that threw inexperienced riders into the rails. Most senior units slowed deliberately. Unit 11 had spent sessions riding the vibration harmonic through with adjusted body weight, a technique Tiv had discovered by accident on the 13th training night and drilled into usable skill by the 20th. They went through the catwalks at a pace that drew audible reaction from the gallery above, not cheering yet. Attention shifting, something uncertain becoming certain. The pressure lock channel ran along the outer hull, sealed but narrow, requiring single file. The Gorith lead unit was ahead of them in the channel, moving correctly but slower than Unit 11 had trained for. At the exact point where a maintenance margin widened briefly on the right and the Gorith rider had to adjust for a floor undulation ahead. Ro moved to the margin and went past. The Gorith rider reacted a fraction too slow. Ro was through. Kessa was through behind him. Tiv passed the Gorith rider and made a gesture that was technically respectful. Vel made the exact same gesture with complete sincerity. The observer section noise was building into something continuous. The inner market district section lined both walls with non-cadet station residents, merchants, engineers, medical staff, children, maintenance crews, beings who treated the race as one of the few events that cut across every division the station created. Most of the noise had been directed at senior units the station had followed for seasons. Then Unit 11 came through in a lead position nobody had predicted. Running at a pace that was not junior, clean, and coordinated from 23 nights of borrowed bay time on older cycles, the market district erupted in patches that joined and became one continuous wall of sound. Pip came through that corridor with his ridge blazing amber and gold at once. He rode through the noise like it was fuel. The old combat simulation ring was where races ended and positions changed. The floor cycled through 3 different materials and 200 units of track, each one gripping differently, each transition capable of throwing an unprepared rider. Unit 11 could not access the simulation ring during race preparation. Kessa had found the maintenance records listing the floor material, specifications, and reconstructed the transition sequence in the equipment bay, using surface patches she sourced from parts storage. It was not the same. It was close enough. Ro took the ring in lead position and felt each surface change arrive exactly where Kessa had said it would. His body adjusted before his conscious mind caught up. Through the first change, the second, the third. Out the other side with pace intact. Kessa through behind him, Tiv through, Vel through. Then Brix entered the ring, and somewhere in the second surface section his bandaged arm failed under the vibration load and the cycle tract left at the third transition. He went down at speed. The ring observers went silent. 1 second. Brix was up. He was bleeding. He picked up the cycle. The front fork was bent at an angle that would affect every remaining corner. He got on. He rode. He exited the simulation ring on a bent fork cycle with a bleeding arm, and something happened. In the small gallery of the ring that had not happened there before, a sound that was not just crowd noise, but recognition. The specific sound that comes from witnessing something that cannot be explained by performance alone. The final corridor was straight and long, running from the simulation ring exit to the central plaza where the finish line was. Drawn in illuminated tape across the full width of the track, long enough to see the finish from the entrance. Long enough to suffer? Ro had been riding past his capacity for 20 minutes and was still going, 'cause stopping was not something he was willing to do. He entered the corridor with a lead that could be held if nothing broke, if nothing failed. If everything he had learned in 23 nights of borrowed time and 2 broken cycles held for one more stretch. It held. He crossed the finish line first. The central plaza, packed with every species on the station who could find a position in the gallery, made a sound that shook the floor. Kessa crossed second. Tiv crossed third with an expression of furious delight. Vel crossed fourth with his methodical face, giving way for the first time to something wide open. Uru crossed fifth, still laughing. Pip crossed sixth and stood over his cycle with his ridge blazing. Every color available to his species at once, and his overlarge eyes bright with something that had no single name. Bricks crossed last on a bent fork cycle with a bleeding arm and did not stop until he was fully over the line. And when he stopped, the plaza was louder for him than it had been for the others because the plaza had watched what he came through to get there. Mira came down from the observer section. The crowd parted for her in the way crowds part for something they have recognized as significant without knowing exactly why. She walked to Unit 11. They were standing together in the way they had stood in the dark bunk block 23 nights ago when Ro had said her name and made a decision. She stopped in front of them. She looked at each one for a long moment. She did not say anything for a while. When she spoke, she said that she had been on 17 stations and 4 planetary postings in her career. She said she had worked with more species than she could list. She said that in all of that time, she had never watched anything like what she watched tonight. Oh, she said she was not talking about the race result. She was talking about who showed up at the bay every night, got back on the cycle after going down, who studied maps in the off hours, who fixed the equipment with their own labor, who rode a bent fork cycle on a bleeding arm to the finish line because the finish line was where they said they would go. She said she had never been prouder of anyone in her life, who had said the least of all of them throughout 14 months and 23 training nights, and one race that changed everything, stepped forward. He reached under his jacket and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside were every small thing Mira had ever left on his bunk. The nutrient packets, the printed constellation image, the notes in his language. He had carried them with him all morning. He held them out to her. He told her in the slow, careful standard tongue he had been working on since the 3rd week that she had been the first person in this big place who saw him before he was worth seeing. He said he had wanted to win for her because she had won for him first, long before there was any race to run. The station hung the banner in the central corridor that afternoon. It read Unit 11, above a course time that would stand as a record for 3 more seasons. Every being who passed through that corridor for the rest of that year saw it. Some of them stopped. Some of them read the unit number and remembered the cubs in the equipment bay at the late hour, the ones on the older cycles with the borrowed time. Some of them had laughed in the early days. None of them were laughing now. Mira Vasquez walked past the banner on the evening of the race day. She stopped. She looked at it for a long time. In her battered notebook, in the section she kept for Unit 11, she wrote 7 names in full Dravari register, then wrote 1 sentence underneath. She wrote that this was what happened when you believed in someone before they had given you a reason to. Not in spite of the doubt around them because of it, because that was always the moment when belief mattered most.